I swear on all that is sacred, I didn't do it. The trembling voice of elderly Miss Aurora echoed in the sepulchral silence of the courtroom, as Judge Helena felt the weight of the gavel in her hands, the verdict imminent. All evidence pointed to the guilt of that fragile woman, but something in Aurora's tear-filled eyes screamed innocence, gnawing at the young magistrate's soul. The conviction was considered certain. Justice seemed blind, deaf, and mute, until a dark shape tore through the air, landing abruptly on the window ledge, and what it carried in its beak would forever change the course of that trial and the lives of everyone there. The silence in the courtroom, which had previously been heavy with the expectation of a sentence, transformed into a stunning void. All eyes, once fixed on Judge Helena and the accused Miss Aurora, now turned to the window ledge. There, imposing and mysterious, a raven with feathers as black as the deepest night observed the scene with an almost human intelligence. Its eyes, small, bright points, seemed to scrutinize the souls of everyone in the room. Judge Helena felt a shiver run down her spine, a sensation that went beyond surprise. It was a premonition, a call echoing deep within her. Miss Aurora, her face marked by anguish and her trembling hands clasped over her chest, looked up at the bird. A spark of something that seemed like hope, or perhaps just a delusion of despair, ignited in her tear-filled eyes. The prosecutor, a man of severe countenance and impeccable posture, frowned, visibly bothered by the unusual interruption. Murmurs began to spread through the audience, muffled but laden with curiosity and astonishment. Suddenly the raven tilted its head and with a precise movement of its beak dropped something. The small golden object glinted under the courtroom lights as it described a brief parabola in the air, before landing with a soft, almost inaudible clink at Judge Helena's feet. It was a locket, a delicate keepsake, which opened slightly upon impact, revealing a tiny glimpse of its contents. Helena felt her heart race. This was no ordinary interruption. It was an intervention. With her breath caught in her throat, she leaned down, her eyes fixed on the object. Her fingers, hesitant for an instant, reached for the locket. The touch of the cold metal on her skin was an electric shock. As she picked it up, she felt the weight of that small treasure, the promise of a hidden truth. The locket was warm, as if it had been kept close to her heart. She slowly lifted it, allowing the light to reveal its interior. An even deeper silence fell over the chamber. The raven on the ledge seemed to wait, motionless. Inside the locket, there was no old photograph or lock of hair, as one might expect from such a personal item. There was something different, something that made Helena's blood run cold and at the same time ignited a flame of indignation in her chest. It was a small fragment of metal, polished and sharp, and beside it a tiny, almost imperceptible inscription. But to Helena, it sounded like a scream. The young judge felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. That fragment, so small and harmless at first glance, was unmistakable. She recognized the texture, the shape. It was the tip of an object that, according to reports, had been used to commit the crime. But how? And why was it there, in that locket, brought by a raven? Helena's mind reeled, trying to connect the dots, while Miss Aurora's face, now pale and wide-eyed, reflected the same shock and incomprehension. The prosecutor, who until then had observed with skepticism, stepped forward, his expression hardened. "Your Honor, what does this charade mean?" His voice, though low, carried a hint of disdain. But Helena didn't hear him. Her eyes were fixed on the locket, and an image formed in her mind, clear and painful, the face of a young man, with a smile she now perceived to be terribly false. Miss Aurora's nephew, the one who had testified with such conviction against his own aunt. The cold and cruel truth began to unfold. Helena looked up, first at the raven, which now seemed to nod its head, and then at Miss Aurora. The elderly woman, with tears streaming down her face, seemed to finally understand that justice indeed had found an unlikely messenger. That small locket was not just evidence. It was the thread of a web of lies that was about to be unraveled. The trial, which seemed to have an inevitable end, had just gained a new and surprising beginning. Helena felt her blood pound in her temples. The small locket in her hand seemed to burn, not from the heat of the metal, but from the intensity of the truth it carried. The face of Ms. Aurora's nephew, previously a secondary figure, projected itself into her mind with disturbing clarity. That smile, interpreted as that of an afflicted relative, was a mask of perfidy. Greed had corroded family ties, transforming the nephew into a dissimulating tormentor. Ms. Aurora, with trembling hands and a different glint in her eyes, fixed her gaze on Helena. The tears, previously of despair, now carried relief and a deep pain, the pain of betrayal. The prosecutor, noticing the change in atmosphere and the intensity in the judge's gaze, cleared his throat impatiently. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we cannot allow such a peculiar incident to derail the course of justice. What is in that object?" His voice was firm, but Helena noticed a slight hesitation. Helena raised the locket. Her voice, though low, resonated with authority. "This object, Dr. Almeida, is not a peculiarity. It is evidence. And, if my assumptions are correct, it could completely rewrite the story presented to us." She felt the weight of responsibility, but also a wave of courage. The intuition that gnawed at her, the feeling that something was terribly wrong, now had form, weight, and irrefutable proof. Her eyes swept the room, lingering for an instant on the raven, which remained motionless on the window ledge, like a silent guardian of truth. Then she turned to the audience, where the murmurs had ceased, replaced by a tense and expectant silence. Everyone awaited her next word. "This fragment," Helena continued, her voice gaining strength, "is the tip of a tool that, according to the experts, was the murder weapon." She paused dramatically. "And the small inscription here, almost invisible, is the monogram of a name we know well in this court." Ms. Aurora's heart raced, and she brought her hands to her mouth, choking back a sob. The truth, though liberating, was also a devastating blow. Helena looked directly at the prosecutor, her eyes flashing with unwavering determination. "Dr. Almeida, I request that Mr. Marcos, Ms. Aurora's nephew, be immediately summoned to testify again, and this time under new conditions." The prosecutor paled. The implication was clear. Marcos's previous testimony, so convincing and damaging to Ms. Aurora, was now under scrutiny. The room erupted in murmurs. The shock was palpable. The idea that the nephew who had shed crocodile tears could be the true culprit was a blow to justice. Helena, however, felt a strange peace. The truth, however painful, was finally emerging. Justice, which seemed to have strayed, was being guided back to its course by a winged messenger and a small locket. The burden on her shoulders had not lessened, but now it was a burden of purpose. Hope, once a flickering flame, now burned with renewed vigor. Ms. Aurora, with tear-filled eyes, nodded slightly, a silent and profound gratitude. Ms. Aurora's silent gratitude, expressed in her nod, touched Helena deeply. That simple gesture, coming from a woman who had been on the verge of unjust conviction, reinforced the judge's conviction that she was on the right path. The prosecutor, Dr. Almeida, however, did not seem to share the same conviction. His face, previously severe, now displayed a mixture of surprise and contained irritation. He knew that the twist not only jeopardized the case, but also his own reputation. "Your Honor, with all due respect, a fragment of metal in a locket brought by a bird. This cannot be considered substantial evidence to shake such a well-founded case." The prosecutor's voice, though controlled, carried a tone of defiance. He gestured slightly with his hands, trying to regain control of the situation that was slipping away with each passing second. Helena, however, remained calm. Her eyes, previously clouded with doubt, now shone with unwavering certainty. Dr. Almeida, justice does not cling only to what is conventional. Sometimes, truth manifests itself in unexpected ways. This fragment, as I have already mentioned, is the tip of the crime weapon, and the inscription, however minuscule, is a monogram that curiously coincides with Mr. Marcus's initials. Furthermore, the locket was with him, in his pocket, before being taken by the raven. She did not reveal how she knew this detail, only the intuition that guided her. A more intense murmur swept the room. The mention that the locket had been taken from Marcus's pocket by the raven, though not witnessed by everyone, added a layer of mystery and shock. The raven on the window ledge let out a low caw, almost like an echo to Helena's declaration, and then remained silent, observing. Miss Aurora brought her hands to her chest, a muffled groan escaping her lips. The revelation that the locket was with Marcus, her own nephew, was an even harder blow. Tears streamed again, but this time they were tears of a different pain, the pain of the most intimate betrayal. The image of Marcus's false smile, which Helena had intuited, now materialized in the elderly woman's mind, eroding memories of affection. Helena felt Miss Aurora's anguish as if it were her own. This was not just a case of legal justice, but a deep human drama, where greed had undone the most sacred bonds. The young judge knew that the path ahead would be difficult, not only for the prosecution, but for the family itself. Dr. Almeida, Helena continued, her voice firm and full of authority, the court understands the gravity of this new evidence. The integrity of a trial demands that all clues be investigated. Therefore, I reiterate my order. Mr. Marcus will be summoned immediately, and given the circumstances, he will be treated as a witness under suspicion, with all the rights and duties that this implies. The prosecutor, his face pale, realized that the battle was lost, at least for now. The determination in Helena's eyes was undeniable. He nodded, defeated, and turned to one of his assistants, giving instructions in a low voice. Helena looked at Miss Aurora, offering a small but significant nod. The elderly woman, with tear-filled eyes, but now with a glint of hope mixed with pain, returned the gesture. Justice indeed was manifesting itself, and the truth, though painful, was beginning to liberate. The raven, with a last look at the judge, took flight, disappearing into the sky, leaving behind a transformed courtroom and the promise of a truth that would finally come to light. The silence that followed the raven's departure was no longer the heavy silence of expectation, but one laden with awe and curiosity. Judge Helena felt a momentary emptiness, as if the mystical part of the revelation had departed. However, the locket in her hand was real, and the promised truth, her responsibility. She looked at Dr. Almeida, who seemed to have lost his composure, his shoulders slumped, his forehead furrowed in perplexity. Ms. Aurora, on the defendant's bench, looked like a statue of pain and relief. Her hands, previously clasped, now open, embraced the bitter truth. Tears streamed, dread replaced by deep melancholy, that of someone who understands the betrayal of a loved one. Helena felt a pang in her heart. Justice was not just about acquitting or condemning, it was about healing wounds. Dr. Almeida, Helena's voice rang clear and firm. The court is aware of the uniqueness of the events. However, truth is the cornerstone of justice, and we cannot ignore such crucial evidence, regardless of how it was presented to us. She paused. The fragment in this locket with Mr. Marcus's monogram is not just a clue. It is a piece that perfectly fits the description of the crime weapon, something that previous evidence did not explain. The prosecutor took a deep breath, trying to compose himself. "Your Honor, I understand your position, but the chain of custody of this evidence is questionable. An animal, a bird, cannot be a reliable witness." He tried to maintain a professional tone, but his exasperation was evident. Helena faced him with serenity. "The chain of custody, Dr. Almeida, will be investigated, but the materiality of the evidence, the object itself, and the correspondence of the monogram with Mr. Marcos's name are undeniable facts. Forensic science can confirm the origin of this fragment and its connection to the crime. The inscription, however small, cannot be dismissed as a coincidence." She turned to the audience, whose members watched every movement. Many, previously whispering about Ms. Aurora's guilt, now reflected on the fragility of appearances. The city, divided, would have to confront a more complex and painful truth. "Given this," Helena continued, her voice gaining a sense of finality, "and to ensure the integrity of this process and the search for truth, the court declares a temporary suspension of the trial. Mr. Marcos will be formally notified to appear for a new deposition, and all evidence will be re-evaluated in light of this new and unexpected evidence. The police will be instructed to initiate an in-depth investigation into the origin of the locket and Mr. Marcos's involvement." A murmur of approval and shock swept through the room. Ms. Aurora closed her eyes, a solitary tear streaming, a mix of relief and deep sadness. Helena felt the weight of the moment. It was not a simple victory, but the beginning of an arduous path to unravel a betrayal. Justice demanded courage to look beyond the obvious, to listen to intuition, and to accept that truth could come from where it was least expected. Helena's gavel, previously about to seal a cruel fate, now rose as a symbol of hope and renewal. Helena brought down the gavel with a firm and decisive sound, echoing the new direction the trial was taking. The noise reverberated through the room, sealing not a conviction, but a promise of truth. The buzz that followed was one of astonishment and speculation, where incredulity mingled with curiosity. The gazes, previously fixed on the elderly woman, now shifted to the door, as if expecting to see Marcos appear at any moment. Ms. Aurora, her eyes still tear-filled, but with a light of renewed dignity, looked at her lawyer, Ms. Silva, who for the first time in weeks allowed herself a small smile of relief. Ms. Silva squeezed Aurora's hand, a silent gesture of support and hope. The elderly woman felt the warmth of that touch, a reminder that she was not alone, even in the face of cruel betrayal. The pain of knowing that her own nephew had incriminated her was a heavy burden, but the prospect of having her innocence proven brought solace. Dr. Almeida, visibly shaken but trying to maintain his composure, approached the prosecution bench. His assistants looked at him with confusion and apprehension. The twist was a blow to his career, but the integrity of the judicial system, which he so valued, demanded that he follow the judge's new directives. He knew that truth, at times, was a double-edged sword, capable of cutting both lies and reputation. Helena observed the scene, feeling the weight of responsibility. The decision to suspend the trial and reopen the investigation had not been easy, but her conscience would not allow her to act otherwise. The intuition that had tormented her was now confirmed, and the satisfaction of having defended justice was profound. However, she knew that the path ahead would be arduous. The city, already divided, would face the shocking reality of a crime committed by someone from their own family out of pure greed. The journalists who filled the front rows were already scribbling frantically, their faces reflecting the excitement of a story that had just taken on dramatic proportions. The news of the suspension and the suspicion about Ms. Aurora's nephew would spread like wildfire, reigniting public debate and testing the community's faith in justice. Helena, with a determined look, addressed the clerk. "Mr. Clerk, Please prepare the necessary documents for the immediate summoning of Mr. Marcos and for the reopening of the police investigation, as instructed. The court will remain in recess until further notice." Her voice, though tired, carried the strength of someone certain of her purpose. She knew that truth, however painful, was the only path to true healing. Ms. Aurora's overcoming would come not only with innocence, but with the acceptance of betrayal and the reconstruction of her faith in humanity. For Helena, the feeling of having been an instrument for this truth was the greatest reward. The locket, now kept, was a silent reminder that justice, in its purest essence, would always find a way to manifest itself. Even through the most unlikely messengers, human connection, so shaken by greed, was beginning to be restored. Human connection, so shaken by greed, was beginning to be restored. However, Helena knew that restoration would be neither a quick nor a painless process. The suspension of the trial and the reopening of the investigation into Marcos, Ms. Aurora's nephew, reverberated through the city like a thunderclap in a clear sky. Conversations in markets, squares, and homes revolved around the raven, the locket, and the shocking possibility of family betrayal. Some praised the young judge's courage in following such an unusual lead. Others, more skeptical, murmured about superstition and the fragility of the judicial system. Ms. Aurora, though freed from the defendant's bench, did not feel the lightness that innocence should bring. In her modest home, surrounded by silence, the pain of Marcos's betrayal was an even heavier burden than the threat of imprisonment. Memories of a boy she had helped raise, of a nephew to whom she had dedicated affection and trust, now transformed into ghosts of disappointment. Her hands, previously trembling with fear, now trembled with the bitterness of family love corrupted by greed. She looked out the window, hoping perhaps that the raven would return to bring her some peace, some explanation for such cruelty. Helena, in turn, dedicated herself tirelessly to the new phase of the case. The locket, now under forensic custody, was analyzed with utmost rigor. Experts confirmed that the metal fragment corresponded to the crime weapon, and that the monogram, though minuscule, was unequivocally Marcos's initials. Science corroborated intuition, but the judge knew that the real battle would be against the culprit's denial and cunning. When Marcos was summoned to testify again, the tension in the courtroom was almost unbearable. He entered the room with a posture that surprised everyone. There was no downcast demeanor of a man caught red-handed, nor the nervousness of someone who fears the truth. Instead, Marcos displayed a cold calm, an almost imperceptible smile that bordered on disdain. His eyes, previously filled with false tears, now shone with a calculated petulance. Helena observed him intently. This was not the man she expected. "Mr. Marcos," she began, her voice firm, "new evidence leads us to question your previous testimony." She showed the locket, now in a transparent casing. "This object was found in the courtroom, and the fragment inside it with your initials is the tip of the crime weapon." Marcos tilted his head, and a dry laugh escaped his lips. "Your Honor, with all due respect, are we talking about a bird that brought an object? This is a circus, not a court of justice. And my initials? Coincidences happen. My aunt, Ms. Aurora, has always been a peculiar woman. Perhaps she is desperate and orchestrated this farce to escape blame, using some story about a raven and a locket." Marcos's accusation, shifting the blame back to Ms. Aurora and discrediting the evidence so audaciously, hit Helena like a shock. The turning point was there. The truth would not be simply accepted. It would need to be wrestled from the clutches of lies with even greater force and conviction. Marcos's cynical smile was a direct challenge to her authority and to the very essence of justice. Ms. Aurora, in the audience, let out a muffled groan. her face contorted with the pain of being attacked again by the one she loved most. The fight for truth was just beginning, and it would be more arduous than Helena had imagined. Helena felt a flush rise up her neck, but it was not anger. It was a cold and unwavering determination. Marcos's cynicism, his ability to manipulate reality and to hurt his own aunt with such cruelty, only reinforced the judge's conviction that she was on the right path. She raised the locket, now visible to all, and her voice, though calm, cut through the air like a sharp blade. "Mr. Marcos, this court is not a stage for farces, nor for unfounded accusations. Science does not bend to coincidences or convenient narratives." Her eyes fixed on his, searching for some crack of guilt, but finding only a disturbing void. Forensic experts have already confirmed that the fragment present here corresponds to the crime weapon. It is not a mere piece of metal, Mr. Marcos. It is the part that broke off during the act, and which, by an extraordinary chance, reached us, and the monogram, however minuscule, has been analyzed and is unequivocally yours. Do you think Miss Aurora, an elderly and frail woman, would have the capacity or cunning to forge such specific evidence involving such an intimate detail of yours?" Helena paused, allowing her words to settle, while the murmuring in the room increased. People exchanged glances, some shocked by Marcos's audacity, others still confused. Miss Aurora, with her hands covering her mouth, shook her head negatively, tears streaming uncontrollably. The idea of being accused of such perfidy by her own nephew was a blow that deeply destabilized her. She looked at Helena, a silent plea in her eyes, a supplication for truth to prevail. Dr. Almeida, who until then had observed the scene with an expression of caution, cleared his throat. Marcos's audacity to accuse the defendant was a risk, but also a desperate tactic that could confuse public opinion. "Your Honor, with due respect, Mr. Marcos's defense has the right to question the origin and validity of any evidence. The way this object arrived in court is, at the very least, unusual, and the accusation that Ms. Aurora could have orchestrated this, though serious, cannot be dismissed without an in-depth investigation." He tried to balance the need for justice with the maintenance of procedural order. Helena nodded slightly, understanding the prosecutor's position. "And it will be investigated, Dr. Almeida. But the material evidence in itself is already strong enough to justify reopening the case and summoning Mr. Marcos under new conditions. The question now is not just the origin of the locket, but what it reveals about the truth of the facts. Mr. Marcos, do you have any explanation for the fact that a fragment of the crime weapon, with your monogram, was found in a locket that, according to witnesses, was in your possession?" Marcos, for the first time, seemed to falter for an instant. A muscle in his jaw twitched, and the cynical smile gave way to an expression of contained irritation. He knew that Helena's logic was relentless. "I have no explanation, Your Honor. Perhaps someone planted this to incriminate me. I am the most obvious person to be blamed, since I am Ms. Aurora's only close relative and, well, heir." The last word came out with an almost imperceptible tone of bitterness, revealing the root of his motivation. Helena noticed the fissure in Marcos's armor. The greed he tried to hide was beginning to manifest. "So you admit that the inheritance is a factor, Mr. Marcos, and that you would have a motive to incriminate your aunt?" Helena's voice was an invitation to the abyss, and Marcos seemed about to fall. The entire room held its breath, feeling the weight of the imminent revelation. The painful and raw truth was one step away from being unveiled. Helena felt a shiver run down her spine. Marcos's admission, however veiled, was the first crack in his impenetrable facade. "So you admit that the inheritance is a factor, Mr. Marcos, and that you would have a motive to incriminate your aunt?" Helena's voice was an invitation to the abyss, and Marcos seemed about to fall. The entire room held its breath, feeling the weight of the imminent revelation. The painful and raw truth was one step away from being unveiled. Marcos swallowed hard, his eyes darting away for an instant before fixing again on Helena, with an intensity bordering on defiance. Motive? Everyone has motives, Your Honor, but that doesn't mean I would act like that. My aunt is my family. I would never hurt her or incriminate her. I merely pointed out a fact. I am the heir. It's logical that attention would fall on me. But this is a trap, a way to divert attention from the true culprit. He tried to sound convincing, but the hint of nervousness in his voice was perceptible. His hands, previously firm, were now slightly clasped, his knuckles white, a sign of his growing tension. Ms. Aurora on the bench closed her eyes, a silent tear streaming down the deep wrinkle beside her nose. With each word from Marcos, a new wound opened in her heart. That boy, whom she had nurtured with such affection, now vilified her shamelessly. The pain of betrayal was almost unbearable, more acute than the fear of imprisonment. She felt her lawyer's pitying gaze, but all she wanted was the truth, the healing for that family wound that gnawed at her soul. Helena observed Marcos with an unwavering expression. Inside, she felt the adrenaline of the hunt for truth, but outwardly, she maintained the icy calm of justice. Mr. Marcos, the court is not interested in convenient logic, but in irrefutable facts. The fragment of the crime weapon, with your initials, found in a locket that, according to witnesses, was in your possession before being taken by the Raven, is a fact. Your attempt to discredit this evidence, attributing it to a farce by your aunt, is a desperate tactic that only reinforces suspicions. She paused, allowing the silence to settle, heavy and laden with expectation, before delivering the blow. Inheritance is a powerful motive, Mr. Marcos. Greed, unfortunately, has corroded family ties for centuries. What do you have to say about the fact that the victim, Mr. Fernando, had recently altered his will, leaving a significant portion of his assets to Ms. Aurora and not to you, as was expected? Helena's question dropped like a bombshell, not only on Marcos, but on the courtroom. The information, which had been kept confidential during the initial phase of the trial so as not to influence the jury, was now crucial. A trump card Helena had masterfully held. Marcos's face paled, losing all color. The cold calm he had maintained until then shattered in an instant, like a sandcastle before a wave. His eyes widened slightly, and he opened his mouth, but no words could come out, only a muffled sound. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, and he tried to run a hand through his hair, a nervous and disheveled gesture that betrayed his composure. The buzz in the room erupted in a clamor of voices as journalists scribbled frantically, aware of the decisive moment. Dr. Almeida, who until then had observed with a mix of apprehension and respect for Helena's perceptiveness, now seemed genuinely shocked. He did not have this detailed information about the will. The judge had kept that card up her sleeve, waiting for the right moment. He knew that Marcos's defense was now in tatters, without arguments. Helena, with a firm and unwavering voice, continued, "Mr. Fernando was a man of means, and his decision to benefit Ms. Aurora, his longtime friend, to the detriment of others, was a surprise to many. Did you, Mr. Marcos, have knowledge of this change in the will?" She was not questioning him. She was cornering him, closing off his exits. Marcos tried to regain his voice, which came out hoarse and trembling, almost a whisper. I didn't know the details, only that he was thinking of making some changes, but that doesn't give me a motive for this." He gestured wildly, his mask of coldness completely shattered. The truth, like a dammed river, was beginning to overflow, and Marcos's dam of lies would crumble. Ms. Aurora, with open eyes, watched the scene, a mixture of pain and a strange sense of justice mingling in her chest. The truth, however painful, was a balm for her wounded soul, a step towards overcoming. Helena, sensing the proximity of the confession, looked at Marcos with an authority that left no room for escape. "Mr. Marcos, this court demands the truth. What did you do?" The final question hung in the air, laden with expectation and the weight of justice. Marcos collapsed. Helena's question, sharp as a dagger, pierced the last layer of his arrogance. His knees buckled slightly, and he clung to the bench, his nails scratching the polished wood in desperation. His face, previously pale and cynical, was now red and streaked with sweat, which ran down his temples. The mask of coldness shattered into 1,000 pieces, revealing the panic and guilt he had tried so vehemently to hide. I didn't want it to happen like this," he stammered, his voice choked, almost inaudible, a thread of sound barely heard in the sepulchral silence of the room. He provoked me. He said I was a parasite, that I would never amount to anything in life, that the inheritance would be for Aurora because she, yes, was worthy. The words gushed from him, disordered, laden with deep resentment and pathetic self-pity. Miss Aurora, upon hearing the confession, felt a chill down her spine that was not of fear, but of a stabbing pain. There was no satisfaction of justice, but the anguish of seeing her nephew, the boy she loved and raised with such affection, crumble before everyone, revealing such a dark and cruel face. Her hands trembled uncontrollably, and she pressed her handkerchief to her mouth to stifle a sob that threatened to escape. The image of little Marcos, running through the fields, playing on her lap, collided violently with the pathetic and guilty figure before her. It was a wound that, she knew, would never fully heal in her heart. Helena, despite the gravity of the confession and the unfolding drama, maintained her composure. Her eyes, however, reflected the inherent sadness of that unveiled truth, the pain of a family torn apart by greed. "Mr. Marcos, are you admitting that you assaulted Mr. Fernando and that you were responsible for his death?" Her voice was soft, but firm, guiding him to the complete admission, leaving no room for evasions. Marcos lifted his head, his eyes red and swollen with tears. "It wasn't my intention. I just wanted to scare him, make him change his mind about the will. We argued, he pushed me. I pushed him back. He fell and hit his head hard. I panicked, Your Honor. I grabbed the weapon which he always kept there and I used it to simulate something else, to incriminate Aunt Aurora. I knew no one would suspect her, that everyone would believe she was capable of an act of desperation, being elderly and frail." The words came out in an uninterrupted flow, a torrent of guilt and despair that could no longer be contained, a river of lies that finally broke its banks. The room was in absolute silence, each person holding their breath, absorbing the raw and brutal truth. Dr. Almeida, his face pale and an expression of deep reflection, merely shook his head in disbelief. The complexity of human wickedness, the way greed could corrode even the most sacred family ties, was something he would never cease to be surprised by. He looked at Helena, a silent respect in his eyes for the perspicacity and courage with which she had unraveled that web of lies. Helena felt the weight of that moment, the gravity of justice being done, but at an immense emotional cost to all involved. Miss Aurora's altruism, her unconditional love for her nephew, had been brutally betrayed. Overcoming for her would be a long and painful path. But now, at least, the truth liberated her. "Mr. Marcos," Helena said, her voice echoing the solemnity of the court with unquestionable authority, "your confession will be recorded. The police will be instructed to proceed with the arrest and appropriate charges. The truth, however painful, is the only path to true justice. Marcos collapsed in tears, a convulsive weeping that filled the room, a sound of anguish and defeat. It was not a cry of deep remorse, but of desperation at being caught, at having his life undone and his lies exposed. Ms. Aurora, in turn, raised her head. Her eyes, though still tear-filled, carried a new strength, a restored dignity. Innocence finally proven was a balm for her wounded soul. The raven, the unlikely messenger, had played its part, bringing light where there had been darkness. Now, it was up to her and Helena to rebuild faith in humanity, brick by brick, showing that human connection, though tested by greed, could be restored by truth and by justice, which in the end would always find its way. Marcos's loud, broken sobs echoed through the room, a raw sound that contrasted with the silence that followed his confession. Police officers moved discreetly to escort him, their gestures firm but respectful. Marcos did not resist, merely allowed himself to be led out. His figure stooped, a portrait of shame and defeat. The door closed behind him, taking with it the last vestige of the farce that had almost destroyed an innocent life. In that instant, the air in the courtroom felt lighter, as if a dense fog had finally dissipated, revealing the clarity of truth. Ms. Aurora, seated on the bench, felt her body relax from a tension she hadn't even known she carried. The tears, which had previously streamed from pain and incredulity, were now tears of relief mixed with deep sadness. The truth freed her from the accusation, but imprisoned her in the pain of family betrayal. She looked at the place where Marcos had been, and the image of the blonde boy with curious eyes, whom she had watched grow up, momentarily superimposed itself on that of the man who had just confessed to a heinous crime. How could love transform into such greed? How could a heart harden to the point of harming its own flesh and blood? Her lawyer, Ms. Silver, gently touched her shoulder, offering a clean handkerchief. Ms. Aurora accepted it, wiping her face with a heavy sigh. The journey to forgive, and perhaps one day to understand, would be long and arduous. Helena observed the scene with contained gravity. Justice had been done, but not without leaving deep scars. The victory of truth was bittersweet, for it revealed human fragility and the capacity for cruelty that lay hidden beneath the surface. She felt a sudden weariness, the emotional weight of weeks of tension finally taking its toll. But above all, there was a profound gratitude. Gratitude for the raven, for the locket, for her own intuition, and for the strength that guided her. Faith in justice, which for a time had wavered, now reaffirmed itself. More robust and resilient, she knew that truth was not always easy, but it was always necessary. Dr. Almeida, with a respectful nod to Helena, began to organize his papers, an expression of relief and seriousness on his face. The news of Marcos's confession spread through the city like wildfire, consuming doubts and igniting compassion. In the markets, bakeries, and neighborly conversations, Ms. Aurora's name was now pronounced with reverence and solidarity. Her innocence, previously questioned, was now a symbol of resilience and unwavering faith. The story of the raven and the locket would become a local legend, a reminder that truth has its own paths, however mysterious they may be. For Ms. Aurora, returning home did not bring the immediate peace she expected. The house, once a refuge, now seemed to echo the emptiness left by the betrayal. But, as she sat in her favorite armchair, with the afternoon sunlight filtering through the window, she felt a small flame of hope. The community, which had judged her, now embraced her with solidarity. Messages of support and affection began to arrive, small gestures that together formed a shield against the pain. She knew she would need time, much prayer, and much strength to rebuild her world. But she was not alone. Human connection, so shaken, was beginning to manifest itself in its purest form. empathy, and mutual support. Overcoming was not just a word, it was a path to be trod, step by step, with the certainty that truth, however harsh, was the foundation for any healing. Helena, in her chambers, reread the case files, feeling the responsibility to ensure that Marcos received just punishment, but also that Ms. Aurora received all necessary support for her recovery. Justice did not end with the confession. It extended to caring for the wounds left by the crime. Ms. Aurora's story would be a constant reminder that, even in the greatest adversities, hope and human kindness could prevail. Helena, in her chambers, reread the case files, feeling the responsibility to ensure that Marcos received just punishment and that Ms. Aurora received all necessary support for her recovery. Justice did not end with the confession. It extended to caring for the wounds left by the crime. Ms. Aurora's story would be a constant reminder that, even in the greatest adversities, hope and human kindness could prevail. She closed the folder, her eyes fixed on the window where the sun was beginning to set. The image of Marcos collapsing was still vivid. His weeping, more of despair than remorse, echoed the greed that had corroded a family. Helena sighed, the weight of her robe feeling heavier. It was not just laws, but wounded souls and human complexity. Exhausted, but with ardent purpose, she felt the victory of truth. Meanwhile, in Ms. Aurora's small house, the silence was almost palpable, broken only by the soft ticking of the clock. Sitting in her armchair, the damp handkerchief in her hands, her gaze lost in the tangle of memories. Marcos's confession had been a final blow, the brutal confirmation that the boy she loved was irretrievably lost. Fernando's face, her friend, also came to mind, and the guilt for not having perceived the wickedness growing so close was a heavy burden. She felt empty, as if a part of her soul had been torn out. The messages of support from the community, the phone calls, the flowers, were kind gestures, but the pain of betrayal seemed impervious to any comfort. How to move forward, how to forgive herself for her blindness. Suddenly a soft knock on the door pulled her from her reverie. It was Ms. Silva, her lawyer, accompanied by Ms. Lucia, a neighbor who brought a platter of cornmeal cake still warm. "Ms. Aurora, we came to see how you are," said Ms. Silva, her voice laden with affection. Ms. Lucia, with her kind eyes, simply smiled and placed the cake on the coffee table. "Don't worry, my dear. The city is with you. No one ever doubted your kindness." Ms. Lucia's words, simple and sincere, touched something deep in Miss Aurora's heart. She looked at the two women, at the cake, and felt a pang of warmth. She was not alone. Human connection, so shaken by Marcos's cruelty, was beginning to manifest itself in its purest form. Tears returned, but this time they were not just of pain. They were tears of gratitude, of recognition of the goodness that still existed in the world. She extended her trembling hand and held Ms. Lucia's, a gesture worth more than 1,000 words. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked. "Thank you for not abandoning me." In that moment, Ms. Aurora realized that, although the wound of betrayal was deep, the love and solidarity of the community were a powerful balm. Overcoming would not be easy, but she would not have to tread it alone. Justice had unveiled the darkest truth, but humanity was there, offering light for the path ahead. It was the climax of her pain, but also the beginning of her acceptance and the promise of a new beginning. Helena, leaving the courthouse, felt the fresh night air on her face. The city, previously divided, now seemed to breathe in unison, relieved by the truth. She knew that her journey as a judge was more than applying the law. It was about restoring faith, healing wounds, and at times being the channel for truth, however improbable, to manifest itself. The raven, the locket, the intuition. Everything fit into a larger purpose. Justice, she understood, was a complex tapestry of laws and hearts, and human connection was the strongest thread that wove it together. The dark night promised a new dawn, and with it, the promise of healing and renewal for all. The dark night promised a new dawn, and with it, the promise of healing and renewal for all. Helena, arriving home, felt the weight of her robe dissipate, but not that of responsibility. Truth had triumphed, but the wounds remained open, and justice, she knew, was a continuous process that extended far beyond the courtroom walls. She sat in her favorite armchair, her eyes closed, reliving every moment of the trial. From the Raven's arrival to Marcos's confession, intuition, the small voice that whispered injustice, had been her compass in the midst of the storm. She smiled slightly, a tired smile, but one of deep satisfaction. Faith in humanity, which for a moment had wavered, now rekindled, stronger and more luminous. The next morning, Helena did not dedicate herself solely to the bureaucratic processes of the court. Her heart impelled her to a more human, more personal gesture. She asked her assistant to arrange a visit to Ms. Aurora. She felt that the elderly woman needed more than legal acquittal. She needed an embrace from the community, a sign that she was not alone in her pain. Meanwhile, in Ms. Aurora's house, the sun streamed through the windows, but the inner light still struggled to manifest itself. She was sitting at the table, drinking tea that Ms. Lucia had prepared, but the taste seemed bland. The presence of her neighbor and Ms. Silva, her lawyer, was a comfort, but the image of Marcos collapsing still haunted her thoughts. "How will I live with this, Lucia?" she whispered, her voice choked, her eyes tear-filled. "How will I forgive?" Miss Lucia held her wrinkled hands. "Forgiveness, my dear, is a long path. It begins by forgiving yourself for not having seen what could not be seen. And the city, Miss Aurora, the city is with you. No one judges you anymore." The doorbell rang, and Miss Silva went to answer it. It was Judge Helena. Miss Aurora, surprised, rose with difficulty. Helena entered, her eyes kind and a gentle smile on her face. "Miss Aurora, I hope I'm not disturbing you," Helena said, her voice calm and comforting. "I just wanted to make sure you were well, and that you knew that justice, however painful, always seeks the truth." She approached and, to Miss Aurora's surprise, extended her hand, not for a formal handshake, but for a warm touch on the elderly woman's shoulder. Miss Aurora felt a lump in her throat dissolve. Helena's words and gesture, a figure of authority who was humanizing herself, were an unexpected balm. "Your Honor, I thank you for your kindness," she managed to say, tears streaming freely now, but they were tears of relief and gratitude. "The truth, it freed me, but the pain of betrayal is heavy." Helena nodded, understanding. "I know, Miss Aurora, but you are not alone. The community embraces you, and you, with your strength and your dignity, will be an example of resilience for all of us." That simple and sincere encounter marked a turning point for Miss Aurora. It did not erase the pain, but it ignited a flame of hope. The solidarity of Helena, Miss Lucia, Miss Silva, and so many others who began to visit her wove a network of support that would help her rebuild her life. Justice had been done in the courtroom, but healing, the true resolution, began there, in the small gestures of human connection, in the certainty that even after the greatest of storms, the sun always shines again, bringing with it the promise of a new beginning. Justice had been done in the courtroom, but healing, the true resolution, began there, in the small gestures of human connection, in the certainty that, even after the greatest of storms, the sun always shines again, bringing with it the promise of a new beginning. In the days that followed, Miss Aurora felt the sunlight, previously filtered by the fog of anguish, invade her home, and, little by little, her heart. The visits from Ms. Lucia, Ms. Silva, and so many other neighbors transformed her small residence into a safe harbor of warmth and affection. Each cornmeal cake brought, each flower placed on her table, each word of comfort and solidarity was a brick in the reconstruction of her faith in humanity. Her eyes, previously filled with deep sadness and almost unbearable pain, now showed small glints of serenity. Her hands, which for so long had trembled with anxiety and fear, now held the teacup with renewed firmness, a sign that life, despite everything, pulsed again. She still felt the sting of Marcus's betrayal, a wound that she knew would take time to heal, if it ever healed completely. But the solidarity around her was a powerful balm, proof that goodness was stronger than wickedness. Ms. Aurora began to go out onto the porch, to water her plants with renewed affection, to chat with passers-by, exchanging smiles and waves. Life, though different and marked by the scars of the past, once again had color and meaning. Overcoming was not a destination, but a path that she, with the support of her community, was willing to tread. Helena, in turn, carried the lesson of that trial as a precious treasure. Her intuition, previously a silent and sometimes questioned guide, was now a powerful and trustworthy voice in her conscience. She understood that the law was merely a tool, and that true justice resided in the ability to see beyond appearances, to hear the whispers of truth, even when they came from unlikely messengers, like a raven. In other cases that followed, she became more attentive to human details, to the stories behind the facts, always seeking the connection that revealed the essence of truth. A gentle, almost imperceptible smile curved her lips when she thought of the golden locket, which she now kept in a small box in her chambers, a constant reminder of her journey. Her eyes, which had seen so much pain and injustice, now reflected a light of purpose and deep empathy. Helena's reputation grew, not only as a rigorous and just judge, but as someone with a rare sensitivity to the complexities of the human soul. The city, previously divided and skeptical, now united around the story of Ms. Aurora and the Raven. The legend of the Raven of Justice spread, told from generation to generation, a reminder that truth always finds a way, and that goodness, even in the face of evil, prevails. Marcos, though imprisoned and facing the consequences of his actions, was a cautionary figure, a reminder of the danger of greed. But the focus was on Aurora, on her resilience, her ability to rise again, and the unwavering strength of her dignity. Ms. Aurora one day sat at the table with Ms. Lucia and Ms. Silva, and for the first time in a long time truly smiled, a smile that reached her eyes. The cornmeal cake had a sweet taste of hope, of a new beginning. She knew that forgiving Marcos would be a long process, perhaps never complete. But she forgave herself for her blindness, for her pain, and that, she realized, was enough to start. Helena, in her chambers, looked at the golden locket she cherished. The small object symbolized the complexity of life, the fragility of truth, and the unwavering strength of justice when guided by intuition and human connection. Life continued, with its pains and joys, but faith in goodness and truth, for Helena and for Ms. Aurora, had been restored, stronger and more luminous than ever. The sun, after the storm, shone, promising a new and inspiring beginning for all, a testament that justice, at times, chooses the most improbable messengers to manifest itself, and that humanity, in its essence, always seeks the light. Months passed since that momentous day in court, and the city of Vale Sereno, once a whirlwind of hasty judgments, now breathed an atmosphere of renewed hope. The sun, which had previously peeped timidly, bathed the streets with full light, reflecting the peace that little by little settled in hearts. Miss Aurora, in her home, felt this transformation deeply. Mornings, previously filled with an oppressive emptiness, now began with the soft bird song and the aroma of coffee that Miss Lucia, her neighbor and inseparable friend, prepared. The pain of Marcos's betrayal was still a scar, a silent reminder of the fragility of bonds, but it no longer paralyzed her. Visits continued, and Miss Aurora's small living room, once a stage of anguish, transformed into a haven of laughter and conversation. She returned to caring for her plants with renewed vigor, each verdant leaf a symbol of life. Her eyes, which had cried so much, now lingered on the details, on the beauty of a sunbeam, on the kindness of a gesture. Overcoming, she understood, was not forgetting but learning to live with memory, allowing love and solidarity to fill the voids. Helena, in her chambers, also felt the echo of that trial in every decision. The golden locket, kept in her drawer, was a silent amulet, a constant reminder that justice was more than the coldness of the law. It was the incessant search for truth, empathy, and the courage to follow intuition. She became an even more perceptive judge, with an eye that went beyond documents, seeking the human essence. Her reputation grew, not only for her legal wisdom, but for the compassion she demonstrated, inspiring colleagues to see justice in a new light. In lectures, she began to share the story of the Raven of Justice, not as an anecdote, but as a testament to the human capacity to rise again and the power of truth. The connection between Helena and Miss Aurora, forged in adversity, blossomed into a respectful friendship. Helena visited Miss Aurora occasionally, not as a judge, but as a young woman who admired the elderly woman's resilience. During these visits, they shared tea and conversations about life, about the importance of forgiveness, not for the offender but for one's own soul, and about how the community had united. Miss Aurora, in turn, saw in Helena not only the judge who had saved her, but a daughter that life had given her, a sensitive and just soul. The city, in turn, was never the same. The story of the Raven and the Locket became part of local folklore, a tale that grandmothers narrated to their grandchildren, teaching about truth and the unlikelihood of its messengers. Marcos, serving his sentence, was a somber reminder of the consequences of greed, but his shadow no longer overshadowed the light that Miss Aurora radiated. Justice, indeed, had found its way not only in the verdict, but in the restoration of faith, the healing of wounds, and the reaffirmation of human bonds. The new beginning promised by the sun had materialized, not as a fairy tale ending, but as the reality of a journey of overcoming adversity, where goodness, empathy, and truth, even if painful, always triumphed, weaving a tapestry of hope for Vale Sereno.